The story of the creation of Spanish Dracula is well known and technically true, though misleading. It goes, with the switch from silent films to talkies, Hollywood studios had to come up with a plan for selling their films to countries with different languages, particularly Spanish. Dubbing was difficult and the subtitles weren't going to cut it, so those with the power decided that the easiest solution was to make a second version of a film. As Universal had decided to make the English language Dracula and were hoping for a hit, a second Spanish language version seemed a reasonable bet. Yes, except Spanish language film duplicates weren't as omnipresent as that account implies. The missing element in the tale is romance, real-world romance. Paul Kohner was a producer at Universal, and he fell for a young Mexican ingenue, Lupita Tovar. Can't blame him. She'd been brought to the U.S. by Fox, but her contract was up, so, low on funds, she was returning to Mexico. As reported by Tovar, Kohner asked her to wait a day for him to work something out. He then went to boss Carl Laemmle, saying that they were leaving money on the table by not using the studio at night, and how about replicating their English movies in Spanish in that downtime? Laemmle went for it, so Kohner put a Spanish-language version of The Cat Creeps into production, with, what do you know, Lupita Tovar as lead. She starred in 2 more the following year, one of those being Dracula. Oh, and Tovar and Kohner were later married, until his death at 85 in 1988. She lived to be 106, dying in 2016, the last survivor of the Universal monsters, living beyond Carla Laemmle by 2 years. And an aside, there's a rumor that Carla Laemmle also played the same part in the Spanish-language version, but I've found no primary sources to back that up, including from Laemmle, and the actresses look and sound nothing alike. So they'd shoot Dracula all day, and after Todd Browning, Bela Lugosi, and the English-language cast left for home, George Melford, Carlos Farias, Lupita Tovar, and the Spanish speakers would get to work. The cast was a mix of Mexicans, South Americans, and Spaniards. Apparently the mix of accents were quite funny to those in Central and South America. Funny and annoying. Melford's assignment as director is hard to figure as he didn't speak or understand Spanish. Whatever the reasoning, this was Melford's 4th Spanish duplicate job. The result is a very good film, with many of the same superb elements as the English version, such as the art design, which I love. Look at that set, the matte paintings, props, and costuming. And then Melford could switch things, like better costumes for the women. So how good is this film? And is it, as has sometimes been said, better than the English version? Let's put a pin in that, at least the which is better part, and first look at it as an adaptation of the novel, because a good adaptation of a good novel is going to be a good movie. Keeping in mind that good adaptation does not mean faithful adaptation, but rather knowing what to keep and what to change. In particular, how does it solve the adaptation problems I mentioned in my first Adapting Dracula video, if it does solve them? Be sure to check out that video. Well, it deals with those problems much like the English version, as they started with the same script. I skimmed exactly what that meant in my video on the English version, as I knew I was going to do it here, so much of what I'm going to say applies to both films. The film, like the Broadway play it was based on, massively compresses the novel's story, but cutting a significant part of the Crew of Light's interactions has surprisingly little effect. Stoker did it himself for an abridged edition. Crew of Light refers to the main male, non-vampire, characters. And eliminating Quincy, the third in every way of Lucy's suitors, is barely noticeable. There's a reason why he rarely exists in any adaptation. His vanishing does not change a single story beat. Cutting Arthur, the successful suitor and high-status moneybags, is another matter, along with switching Dr. Seward from youngish suitor to being Mina's father. Lucia, as Lucy is called in this version, now has no suitors to care about her, and hardly a story, meaning the emotional core is missing, along with the dread connected to it. And Eva, that's Mina, also renamed in the Spanish film, isn't developed enough in the movie to take on the extra weight of being the emotional center. Now that's more true of Mina in the English version, as Tovar makes Eva much more playful and engaging, but it's still the case. This could be fatal to an adaptation, but it's not, because the not-so-secret weapon of this film is Renfield. In giving the initial scenes in Transylvania to Renfield instead of the book's Harker, he becomes our portal character. And because he ends up being so much more interesting and fun than Harker ever could be, we care. or I did. Renfield suffers more than in the book, and we can see the devastation Dracula causes through him. So there's still an emotional core. And we still get Lucia, Lucy, and Eva, Mina, as victims as in the novel, so that works. Renfield is treated well in both the 31 films. These are the only adaptations that include his most important and memorable speech. Even versions that claim faithfulness to the book don't have it. Besides interactions and character, the film also cuts locations, which in the book are all over continental Europe and England. But the heart of the story can be told just using the asylum, Eva's home, Carfax Abbey, and the initial visit to Transylvania, the last of which the play cuts but the films restore, and smartly so, as that's arguably the most memorable part of the novel. The films also add a location, a London opera house, and in the English version only, the street near it, which helps to avoid that film seeming too stage-bound. The Spanish one only adds the opera house, and as it spends substantially more time in drawing room discussions, Browning cuts about 20 minutes of that, it has a harder time escaping its stage roots. It could have been opened up a bit. Another issue with the reduction of locations is that there really isn't any place else Dracula could be than in Carfax, which does dim the excitement a bit. Juan, that's Jonathan, and Van Helsing aren't even hunting Dracula at the end. They just happen to be out and wander next door. Which leads us to what is often said to be a negative, the elimination of the return to Transylvania for the climax. But if runtime is an issue, I don't think that's a bad cut. The problem isn't where the climax happens, but rather that it's not much of a climax. In the book, the crew of Light find the non-moving Dracula in his box on a wagon. A quick stab with a knife, he's dead, and the novel's over. While in the movie, the crew of Light find the non-moving Dracula in his box in the Abbey. A quick pound with a stake, he's dead, and the film's over. The issue isn't being unfaithful to the book, but being too faithful. The book's climax doesn't work on screen, which is why many adaptations change it. I suspect the Universal bosses felt that the notion of staking someone was so ghastly that the concept alone would do the trick. Maybe it did in 31. However, they actually did give the climax a bit more of a kick than in the book by giving us Renfield's dramatic death, which takes place earlier in the book, as well as upping the stakes by having Eva physically kidnapped by Dracula. It's not exactly an adaptation win, as the ending is not the strongest portion of the film, but it isn't bad, and it does keep true to the book. One issue is that the characters don't translate well into modern times and into American culture, as they are privileged, snobbish British elites carrying a theme of xenophobia about them. But this film, and its English counterpart, do a nice job of dealing with that. Dropping Arthur eliminates the most elite of the elites. Cutting the search for Dracula and return trip to Transylvania cuts the characters' constant bribery. It's a big part of the novel, and using their status, as well as making fun of the poor. Poor people are mostly comic relief in the novel. But the biggest way the film solved this problem was by that swap of Renfield for Juan in the trip to Transylvania. Renfield is just a guy who becomes enjoyably crazy. He doesn't have the stench of privilege about him, and his descent into madness gives us several of the film's most iconic moments. This makes Juan/Jonathan a secondary character, just the boyfriend. Eva/Mina becomes just a victim, and Sword, the father. The main characters are now Van Helsing, Renfield, and Dracula. So it's no longer a problem that the story wants us to root for some posh British folk, because we aren't. And that last sentence also shows that the filmmakers dealt with the final problem. That being, Dracula isn't in a majority of the novel, but film audiences want him to be on screen. The play changed the character to make him suave, sexy, able to mix with society, so he could visit, creating new scenes for the Count. The film kept those, and then added back in the scenes in his castle from the novel, while cutting material where he wasn't involved, greatly increasing the percentage of time he's around. So yeah, there's Dracula in this Dracula, and that's a good thing. Of course, that means film Dracula isn't much like novel Dracula. Well, filmmakers have a choice, because in all of the many adaptations, no one has worked out how to keep the character like he is in the book and make him a frequent on-screen presence. I think it can be done, but I'm very sympathetic to this choice. Now, there are a few differences between the Spanish and English versions as far as adapting the novel. Because Todd Browning and Carl Laemmle cut the script, the English version is nearly a half hour shorter, with mostly cuts to dialogue that surprisingly have little effect, adaptation-wise. The one clear exception is the staking of Lucy, which is a big deal and something you want in your adaptation. Well, kinda cut it. It's not shown in either, but Van Helsing and Juan talk about how they just staked Lucia, while Van Helsing and Jonathan are just standing outside the cemetery and we're never told why. The why is because they just staked Lucy, and you can infer that, but I'll give an adaptation point to Spanish. There's another pertinent script difference, this time because the Laemmles had a strong no homo policy for Dracula, so didn't want him biting men. In the script, and thus the Spanish version, it's the three brides who bite Renfield. Browning thought this was stupid, ignored the order, and had Dracula do the biting, and in doing so, had Dracula stop the brides and force them back, which is an iconic moment in the book. So, a minor adaptation point to the English. Taken all together, that means I call both the Spanish and the English good adaptations of the novel. Not terribly faithful, nor incredibly unfaithful, as others will be, but presenting the most important and engaging parts of the novel while adding a few indelible moments. Which means it's time to take the pin out of which is better, Spanish or English. And I'm immediately sliding it back in as this video is long enough, so I'm splitting that off. So come back for the next video in my Adapting Dracula series, which will be English Dracula versus Spanish Dracula. And please, like and subscribe if you like this.